Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The World Can Wait. We're excited to be here. I'm excited, especially for this one. This is a hot topic in our society right now. Tonight, we are talking about critical race theory. Um, if you don't know what critical race theory is, don't worry. Apparently, you're not alone because it seems like not a lot of people actually know what critical race theory is. There are a lot of different schools of thoughts on what it is, what it means, what it's going to do, whether it's good, whether it's bad. And so tonight we plan on discussing it, trying to get a definition for what it is, when did it start, why is it so prevalent right now, is it good for us, is it bad for us, and how should we approach this thing moving forward. So I'm gonna pass it off to Charles. He's gonna open us up in a prayer, and we can get this thing moving. All right, so we are joined by two guests today. We're excited to be able to have some different perspectives, to hear some different trains of thought as to what this thing is, what we think about it, and how do we move forward with it. But to kind of kick things off, we just want to hear from you guys. What do you understand critical race theory to be? When you hear critical race theory, what does that mean to you? What do you think? But to kind of kick things off, yeah, either one of y'all can jump off with it.
I can start. So critical race theory means a very, very specific thing to me, in part because it's a part of my training as an academic. And I've actually spent a decent amount of time in classes very focused and informed by critical race theory. And so I've actually been very, very confused. People have talked about it. It's always interesting when somebody asks me about it, because then they'll say, what about this claim? And I'm like, actually, never has a crit ever said that. So critical race theory, specifically, the original meaning of the term, refers to a set of or a particular movement in the study of law that happens around the 70s and the 80s, and is particularly concerned with thinking about the ways in which the law discriminates on the basis of race, has a disproportionate impact between people who are white, people who are non-white, and the various possible solutions and ways in which someone can address that. And something that's very important about critical race theory that is entirely absent in any of the discussions that are happening right now is that it actually is a response to an earlier movement in legal studies called critical legal studies. Now, critical legal studies basically makes two kind of overarching claims. The first claim is that the law is often used by those who have money, those who have power, and is often twisted to serve those particular ends. Just to be honest, it's kind of a Marxist-inflected view of the law. And if you think about it, it kind of makes a lot of sense. Who has the ability to write laws? Who has the ability to lobby people to make sure that the laws that are produced or that are written as bills get passed and made into laws, right? Who has the ability to buy lawyers who can defend their claim and have or employ firms that have tons and tons of lawyers to make sure that they can win a lawsuit or defeat a lawsuit whenever. It's people who have lots of money. However, the other claim that critical legal studies made was that law is so slippery because of that ability for someone to sort of argue in the court of law, because it requires interpretation, because it's not easy for lay people who don't work in the legal sort of system to understand it, how it operates, because it requires that expertise. It basically does not guarantee justice for those who don't have access to those. And so it sort of kind of ends in that sort of position where it's like, yeah, the law is always going to screw us over. It's always going to step on our necks if we don't have access to levers of power. So then we should be done with that. Critical race theory is a response to that because they didn't think that was okay. They thought that you should always be trying to push, always try to take that spirit of the civil rights movement and bring it to the law so that we can change it and actually make progress. It's not defeatist. It doesn't think that America is evil. It doesn't think that law is always bad. It's actually quite progressive and is trying to make the world a better place. But no one's really talking about that because no one really understands that as critical race theory. One more thing I'll add before I shut up. Critical race theory has one thing in common with critical theory writ large, in that usually when people use the term, they mean it in a kind of expansive sense, so that it's not just people who are talking about law, but sometimes people who are talking about sociology. Sometimes people are talking about economics. Sometimes people talk about philosophy, can be engaging in sort of critical theory or critical theory inflected things. And particularly for me, a lot of people have made the argument that when Toni Morrison wrote a book called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the American Literary Imagination, where she starts thinking about race in the sort of American literary canon, that is very inflected and informed by critical race theory and is in many ways a work of critical race theory in and of itself. So while critical race theory might start from that very traditional beginning, I think its spirit has kind of moved on and existed in all these other sort of fields. So if I had to kind of explain what it is, given however long I've spent with it, that's what I'd say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, and that hold on, there you go, there you go.
Right.
He said, I think I gotta
That was
I'm
the
out.
right thing.
But then I hit kill camera, my bad.
Yeah, you good. Okay. So Keller, I'm,
They were like,
I'm
okay.
really interested to hear what you have to say as well, especially I mean we've talked a little bit earlier about, where you are in your county and kind of the view of critical race theory there. I'm really interested to hear about that just in like your general area and what's around you. How critical race theory is perceived kind of like stack up against what we just heard from Terrell?
Well, I don't. I'm just going to start off by saying I'm not at this point representing my county more than I'm an employee from it.
Right, yeah.
So it's just I'm more just saving my butt with this comment. Anything I say doesn't directly reflect the county I work for. It's more of I'm just, and I teach math, so there's a lot of aspects where if this probably won't get applied where I teach, but if it was, it wouldn't be in a classroom that I am in, minus past my time as a special education teacher where we look at things like the fact that I'm in a mostly rural white area. That's the major population, but the majority of students, or there's a high population of percentage of my students that are of color. Very few female as well, which sped conversations are a whole side thing of it. I'm still trying to figure it out because there is hearing Terrell share about it with the whole law side. I was kind of looking into it, but I think the big reflection of my current area around me, which I haven't talked to a lot of folks, haven't gotten out much, and a lot of folks are busy around me. But the big thing I see of like why they don't like it is the fact that it is in fact Marxist. I live outside Liberty, and so a lot of people when they hear critical race theory, a lot of conversations I had with me in the past years about like being involved with organizations like Black Lives Matter or marching and stuff like that, the number one comment I got back was like, yeah, but that's Marxist. And I apologize. My wife's out at D&D and my cat's making sure I know that I am the one that has to pet him tonight. So I apologize for that. So there's still I'm trying to process of it. Like I posted, I do find it interesting that it's one of those, I don't know. I know Dom and I are talking about some stuff I think we'll save for later. And Terrell, you kind of like threw me for a loop. That was a lot more comprehensive than I was expecting. So thank you for that. I'm trying to like process all that right now because I did my own homework on this, and my notes are like nowhere near sufficient. So I'm sorry if I seem blank. But normally,
Terrell, the man who makes everyone else feel inadequate.
Seriously. But no, I think like there's a lot of point in that where if I had to guess, because I was watching a lot of stuff, because even though I have of the past like year or so, a few years identified as someone who's progressively liberal, I try to go into this conversation looking at as many conservative arguments for it or against it as possible, just so that I can make sure I'm not in an echo chamber here. But one of the things I think that, at least in my immediate reaction or talking with my friends, as well as some mutual friends between Dom and I, the main conversation we have is of how people's reaction to it is one. I live in an area where I guess leave. School and parent choice is a real big factor. So the concept of putting something into the schools that the parents don't necessarily agree with, that's one of the factors why a lot of folks don't like it. Another one is, I think, one is misinformation, and I have a whole spiel about that, but I'll save that for later. I don't want to get away from what it is and the people's reaction to it. And three, I think there's a lot of it where part of Marxism that I struggle as I am becoming less capitalistic as I get older, which is kind of ironic. But it's the concept of, I think that a lot of people at the heart know is Marxist but disagree with, and especially critical race theory, is the concept of the bourgeoisie and proletariat. I always get mixed up at which one is the ruling class, which one's the underclass. But the
bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
You can tell it because the word bougie comes from it.
There you go. Okay. I know, like, so the proletariat's always trying to overthrow the bourgeoisie. And the way I got taught socialism and stuff like that is like, so they get that, which is great, and it's equal, but then one class rises up again. So it's always a struggle like that. So a lot of folks are really worried when critical race theory is implemented, it's going to kind of have that flip side of America is all of a sudden going to become Black America or Latin American America. It's like, so it won't be white America. So not necessarily like a cultural shift in just like more multicultural, like it's the idea of we're going to put a class over top another class, are some concepts which, as much as I think leveling the playing field, I see some biblical principles where that makes sense. Marxism at its core, that class warfare is kind of ingrained in there, as much as it is like classism is a part of capitalism, where it's more like the rich and the poor, and stuff like that. So that's a long-winded explanation. I hope I'm getting some stuff. I reached out to a lot of folks, and that's some of the things that they expressed to me, as well as someone who's actually I want to like this theory. I've taught some ways. I've had some chances over the past few years of either being briefly in a history classroom when they were talking civil rights or antebellum and post-Civil War. Or I know Dom and I have talked about a lot. I did a marching band show where I was teaching, and the director wanted to do a show about 1968 at a very small country school. And I'm like, come on. And even though at the time I was still, I will admit, I was kind of trying to be on topic, but like I made sure my kids knew what we were talking about. And then I looked into critical race theory and I realized, oh, I'm actually kind of doing some of these things as a teaching tool. But then I also don't know if that's part of critical race theory more than just me being a good teacher. Because I think it's, because if it's one of those, if I'm coming from the mindset that America is systemically racist, we could say like, if the whole world's out against Black America. So one of the other arguments that I heard, I was watching some PragerU as well as some, and into a Steven Crowder, because one of those, I was trying to get as much from everything as possible, and one of the quotes PragerU said, which actually I really can't disagree with, which is, if you look for something racist, you can always find it. And that's another argument of where critical race theory at like its absolute extreme. It's the conversation of like, I got to go to college, someone else didn't. They chose trade school, I chose college. I'm also in education, where I have to go to college and I have to go to grad school to, get paid more. And so I'm in a career that wants to go that way. But, there's no Black teachers at the school I work at. So that's why there's no Black teachers coming from the area that Mr. Keller works at. So that school must be racist because they're doing blank, blank, blank. But it's like, no, I've talked to my principals and they've talked to me about it. And they're just like, no one's applying for jobs. So it's one of those things that, like, if I look at that, I could easily point the finger to my principal saying like that, but I can guarantee my building, they're really trying to actively, make sure it's more blended. And so there's a lot of things where I think on the core value, it works really well. Well, I think the gray areas of how it's implemented, especially in education, is one that if we push it in immediately in the classrooms, it will fail. But if we take our time, which sadly, a lot of things have to take more time, and I wish they could just flip a switch and everyone's happy and it's great. But as Dom said earlier, it's really complicated, and it's kind of as like Terrell really hit on the head. we've really separated from what it actually is. And even I think my part in that kind of shows that, where it's like Terrell just led about, this is like the Webster's definition of what critical race theory is. This is what it's defined. I talked to a lot of different people about it and got to interact with a lot of folks about it. And this is all the conversations I got. You know, I just Googled critical race theory about an hour ago just to kind of refresh myself on some stuff. And like the first, like just trying to find out what it is. And the first 10 videos were like, you know, critical race theory in Loudoun County, black father destroys critical race theory. This is what critical race theory is, blah, blah, blah. And it took me a while to get to someone saying, this is unapologetically what it is. So I guess I'll start now. It's one of those conversations that sadly, no matter how you look at it, it's going to be political in its definitions. That honestly sucks because every definition of it's going to be skewed. And I don't know. It's kind of frustrating as someone who's just curious about it, because I haven't been able to find something that makes sense that's able to be implemented. You know, I found like, you know, oh, all teachers have an implicit bias against students if they don't know that, blah, blah, blah. If I'm looking for that and I believe that there's societal racism, I'm going to find it's like, oh, yeah, you know, I know this one teacher that they were super racist to that student. Not recognizing that, no, that student was just acting up. Was it because they're black and that's why they were doing something, so the teacher was doing that? Or was it just simply the student was acting up? And that, I had a conversation with another teacher that was just like, so we're going to start punishing students for being black or treat them differently because they're black, because they act differently and stuff like that? Because, you know, most areas, there's higher dropout rates amongst African Americans and students of color. There's higher rates of students of color receiving special education services, a lot of stuff like that. Am I just now going to say that a lot of folks are words like, okay, so critical race theory, that just means that all schools are racist because we do it that way? And it's one of those bag of cats. You just open up the bag and there's another bag and it keeps going and keeps going. So I'm sorry for the rabbit trail about that. It's just from, I guess, like representing the white side of America in this conversation. It's a really complicated thing. And especially with as divided as white America is, which is honestly flying either neoliberal or borderline fascist. And so there's not much middle ground conversations about this. And it's really annoying because I hate the neoliberal side of like, if you don't like critical race theory, you're absolutely racist. Or the more conservative side, which is if you like conservative critical race theory, you're just a hippie and you're just all this other stuff. And I'm like, we said we want something different, and I'm trying to be critical and be open-minded to some stuff. So there's my giant spiel about it all.
So I'm somebody who, like, I don't have a real good understanding of this whole thing. I've seen a lot of the arguments from both sides. The best that I can come up with from all that I've heard and seen in my research, like you said, like I'm looking at all these different places, I'm seeing a lot of similar things, but there are some differences. But ultimately, what I've come to is like critical race theory is just telling the truth, like telling the story and then the implications of what comes from the actions that led to the story that's being told. And I don't understand how that's a problem in any way. I mean, which is why I feel like I'm missing something, right? Because it's like, no, like who really wants to be lied to? And, like all I hear from critical race theory is, let's not lie to people. Like, so am I missing something there, or like, is it really that simple? And the world is just crazy. Like I don't.
It kind of is.
Okay.
And I'm gonna add one thing, and I really don't want to dominate this conversation, but this is one thing I think that's kind of important to understand about critical race theory. It emerges at a point in time when, and this is one of the things that critical race theorists kind of just hold to be true, there are people who are on the liberal side of the fence and people who are on the conservative side of the fence. Both of them operate in ways that are racial or don't necessarily take into account racial others or the systemic racism of the system. And so one of the things that just kind of needs to be put on the table more often than not is, you know, David, you mentioned that students can sometimes, or there's inequalities in terms of Black student performance in schools, just like across the board. So then when there's a program that's aimed at reaching out to inner cities that are primarily Black, or is particularly concerned with Black achievement gaps, and someone says, well, nah, that's like a waste of money, or that's racist, or so on and so forth, critical race theory is there to kind of say, maybe this is making a race-conscious decision, but given that there are inequalities, how else are we supposed to address that? And that is way more productive from a critical race perspective than trying to like, oh, then the school's obviously racist. It's like, well, the school's a part of a history that has a lot of racial disenfranchisement, so what do you expect?
Yeah.
Right? Like throwing around you're racist and you're racist and you're racist. Once you start reading critical race theory, the first thing you learn is like, that's useless. Like, I'm living in a house in Nashville, Tennessee, that probably has been, a part of various schemes of gentrification to try and push low-income Black and brown folks to certain parts of town, right? By virtue of the fact that it's close to certain areas, it's close to certain places of business, it's close to the school. So they know that they can charge a certain amount so that, X people can afford to be here, people who can't get out. And there was probably a point in time where it didn't look like it looks right now, but there was a move to make it look that way. By me choosing to live here, I'm probably participating in schemes that, support that. And then if we really want to kind of back up and say it, well before this was Nashville, Tennessee, or any of that, it was Native American ground. And where are they? I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
Probably no longer exist.
Yeah.
And that's bad and was racist. But what is me saying that and then getting upset at that? And who would I get upset at? Myself for living here? The landlord who I pay rent to? The company that owns the property? Like, yeah, they probably are wealthy and are benefiting from the situation, but it doesn't really, what does that do for the question of justice?
Yeah, and I think that's also like where a lot of I've really tried to like force myself in the past few days, because I shared something that like was my understanding, and I got like a lot of flack from it. And when I just shared a post and I had like a long comment, which was fascinating to me. I had a couple of folks that I think were like a bit way too disenfranchised of what it is, and some were just like, I just disagree with it, and I'm like fine with that. And like, hey buddy, hi. And I just, sorry, my cat just distracted me. Hopefully I'll get back on topic. And so like some of the ways like I apply it, which I think is one of the things, at least when I discussed it with some conservatives, and again, I'm trying to like get their input as much as possible. I know Dom and Charles have discussed like it's been really hard to get some people in there for that, and I've just been able to, my family doesn't like it, and we got a bunch of friends in our area that doesn't like it, so I just want to reiterate, I've been talking to a lot of those folks trying to get, and I think I do agree with them a lot of aspects where like, kind of as you mentioned, like if we're starting programs that are like strictly for Black students to help them out when they're younger, it's like, well, again, I think some folks are worried critical race theory is going to like only focus on those students and not on others, where it's one of those things that's like, oh, we see these scores there, so let's start putting all this money just towards the Black students, blah blah blah. And then then my brain's just kind of like, well, it's not necessarily a race issue, it's more of a financial issue, because we see that across the board and a lot of other stuff. But where some folks are worried of critical race theory, that we're going to start looking at groups of people as groups of people rather than looking at them as individuals, where some folks are just naturally smarter. I've got some students on my caseload that just simply struggle to write stuff down. So something that I have the benefit of, that I've always had sloppy handwriting, but I could say like I'm privileged because I had both a mom and a dad sit me down and teach me handwriting. And then this other student who, and I have multiple students, a couple of them are color, a couple of them are white. It's like, oh, is this really like a giant thing, or is it just more stuff like that? Where I think some of the worries of critical race theory is we're going to start just taking those quote unquote stereotypes and put them on groups of students and saying they're not succeeding because X, Y, Z, and then like blanket across the board I, as who I believe to be, and I'm nowhere near saying this title, like to think I'm going to be a good teacher someday. I work hard to avoid that, and especially in SPED where it's like, oh no, this student does this way, this student does that way, this one likes that, and like I try to take as much of an individualized plan as possible because that's my job title. But I think some parents are worried that we're going to do that to other people as well, which I actually think is a genuine benefit because I think some of the folks that only look at this as a surface level issue will totally do, you know, because as we're trying to have a better application of what it means to be American with in the concept of really understanding where we've been as a country, what we've done, you know, we could do that whole, I guess, like quote unquote reverse racism thing where we try and like have that moment of strict whiplash where all of a sudden we're like doing all these things and we're gonna try and do something different and then do some other things. So yeah.
That makes me think, and obviously there does have to be balance with things and how things
Oh
are
yeah.
adapted. But when I hear this idea of, hey, well, why is this program only for black students or why is this only for black people, blah blah, it makes me think of redlining.
Yeah.
And so for those viewers who don't know anything about redlining, basically politicians got together and decided, okay, we're going to draw circles around these areas and we're going to list them as financial risks because they're poor areas. Generally, those areas contain nothing but black folks. So when you have these financial risk areas, banks decided, okay, we're not giving out loans to anybody that's in these financial risk areas because they're a financial risk. So if you don't get loans, you have an idea, you want to start a business, you need a loan for this, that, or the third. You're not getting a loan. You continue to stay in that impoverished situation. And so you say, okay, well, let me move out of this thing. Let me move to somewhere else. Well, what if you can't afford to live at another place? You know, think of housing policies, like what is it, single family zoning. Yeah, single family zoning, where this area is set up to where you can only build single family homes here. You can't build apartments here, can't build duplexes, you can't build any kind of townhome, anything like that. So if you can't afford a single family home, you can't move to this area, you can't move out of this red line district. You're stuck where you're at. You let that go on for a few generations, and you can see how it's tough to build wealth that you can pass down to someone else. It's tough to build wealth for yourself. So that if a program comes in and says, okay, people outside of this red line district, they're doing fine. They've got money because they're able to take out loans to start businesses. They can take out loans to buy homes. They can take out loans to pay down debt. They're able to take care of themselves. But people in this red line district, they're not. They need help to get to where everyone else is at. So if I make a program that's just for the people in this red line district, it's not a thing of like, okay, I'm going to put you on top of everyone over here. It's, I'm going to get you to where they're at. But if I make a program for everybody, then they're going to go up and you're still going to be behind them the whole time. So this idea that if I make something just for black people, it's just going to put black people ahead of everybody. It just, if you actually kind of look into some of the programs and some of the things that I think these fears are coming from, um, and you have to look deeper than just the surface. And I think that's what critical race theory is for. Don't just look at the fact that I set up a housing program for black people. Let's look at why I set up a housing program for black people. Let's look at what laws were put in place to get black people to a point where they need someone to set up a housing program from them. And I think if we get to that point where we can actually look and diagnose what the real issue is, I feel like a lot of those programs start to not look like we're taking over the country and then start to look like we're just trying to give some people some equity. But I think the big challenge is how do we get people to look at this and say, hey, there's actually a root cause to this poverty that you see before you now, and we want to fix that. I think that's the big thing is how do we get people to actually look at that and get rid
It
of that
seems
fear.
like the word race is probably the problem because ultimately you just described critical thinking in general. Like
Yeah.
I have this problem. This is like what the problem is, and where did it come from?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
Like, where did it come from? Here's a solution. You said you thought of replying. I thought like when you were speaking, you thought of HBCUs, and you hear a lot of artists like, well, why are there all these black schools? And it's like, well, there had to be. Like that's why. If there didn't have to be, there wouldn't be.
And
And I even feel like that's really critical thinking. That's just like there, like there had to be. So
Not to mention, one, white students can apply to HBCUs. They don't. We'll get back to that. Two, here's the thing about quote unquote affirmative action, which is a ghost that's kind of haunting this conversation.
Yeah.
If a white student applies to Howard, they would receive affirmative action because they would be a minority in that context.
Right. That's a good point.
It would be easier for them to get in
they get grants
precisely because of that.
yeah.
But here's the thing, they often don't, because here we have this black institution, Howard, which in many ways is one of the crown jewels of HBCUs, compared to the crown jewels of primarily white institutions. Harvard, Princeton, Yale.
not Liberty.
It's not Mary Washington either, don't feel bad. But that gives you a sense of, people that have several HBCUs. These are institutions that, one, you can go to, but also aren't really taking that much away from you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that brings me back to this big fear. And Kelly, you were talking about it a lot, just in like what you've kind of heard and stuff. It's just it's a fear of, I think you said, like a shift where non-whites are going to be on top of the country and now white people will be below everyone else. And I'm curious as to, I'm sure no one probably has the answer here, but I'm curious as to where that fear even comes from.
I can answer that directly.
Okay, well he got an answer for me. Okay.
And it's one of the reasons, and again, so some of the background of me, my parents are awesome. My parents are very Republican folks, but one of the things I do enjoy about them, they open me up to a lot of ideas, a lot of conversations. But I did end up going to private school, and have been around mostly conservatives my whole life. And some of the ways affirmative action got discussed to us, which, if I've noticed anything, just random observation, more liberals' ideas just only focus on the good and ignore the bad sometimes. Most conservative ideas only focus on the bad and not the good. For example, just as a quick example so I can go into this and make sense, transgender bathrooms. The conservative there, it's like, you know what? Yes, sex offenders could now go into a bathroom saying they identify as a male, go in a female bathroom. That's an issue. Liberal side, what if we just make unisex bathrooms? But the two sides don't ever have a middle point. They just sit there. What if we did this? Well, what about this? What if we did this? What about that? And it's a really annoying part. One of the things that got discussed when affirmative action came up is, I'll quote scripture on this, as with the concept of like women pastors. I believe one of the Bible's implications about like women in leadership, which I think women should be in leadership, but some of the things it's clear, it's like the Bible hints at it should most likely be a man, but when there's no man, a woman should be there to step up and should be allowed to take its place. Some of the fear at times is like some people look at that, it's like, we should have women pastors, and they just throw them in there. And then, well, what if they're not qualified? What if we just hired this person just because they're a woman? Or in some cases of affirmative actions, some of like the more downside of it's like, okay, there's very, very minimal black CEOs. What if we just put some black folks in to be CEOs just so it looks more equal? Well, then it's like, okay, we are now correct. We fixed racism, but we over promoted somebody simply because of their race. We don't know them as an individual. So it's one of those, it's a slippery slope, because like that is a fear of someone trying to be, which I'll use this term properly, trying to be woke, when people don't realize we left the word woke back in 2018 and we're just trying to be decent human beings now, and are trying to do these things to not seem racist, but are actually, they're not just not being racist, they're just kind of being good for the sake of being good, but they're doing it badly. So when a lot of folks are worried about how they like get that there, it's kind of a challenge because you have some folks that have not had access to education throughout their family history consistently. It's a challenge to find some folks to put in those areas. You know, when you have, I've got some students that no one in their family's gone to college. And so if I want to have them have someone to look up to, it's going to be a challenge to find somebody because historically, it sucks to say that student is most likely not going to do very well in the grand scheme of going to college, getting a job, holding it, stuff like that. They totally can succeed, but we see some things. And so if I just take that student and for the sake of equality, not equity, just keep promoting them because of these things, it's one of those that we're gonna have experiences where we've put people. I think it's called like it's not the Peter Principle, it's something else. Where like we just have people in positions of power that the only reason that they're there are like super like not temperamental.
To satisfy
Yeah.
society's
Yeah.
warrior.
Yeah.
And I feel that.
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with any aspect of critical race theory having anything to do with just promoting people to anything in any way.
So with
CEO what business has ever appointed a CEO on the basis of race alone?
I can't think of one.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just like curious. Like that
Yeah.
sounds like something that affirmative action could suggest to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious as to whether or not that's just an affirmative action boogeyman. Because we're talking about corporations.
For the record, I agree. I think it's an affirmative action boogeyman that has a absolute tiny kernel of truth. That when some folks approach issues like this is the big thing they look at. It's like, okay, are we just going to instantly say this person was evil because they're in a position of power that happens to be white? Like you hear it all the time where like whenever slavery gets talked about and stuff like that, it's like it was society. I teach math. I can't talk. Big words are hard. It was socially acceptable for people to own slaves back into colonial days of America and early parts like that, where it's like, yeah, George Washington owned slaves. There's a lot of things like that, but sometimes you have some folks that are more on the what I call like the absolute neoliberal, trying to just go after evil people. It's like George Washington owned slaves. I can't respect him. And a lot of stuff like that. And so you have some folks that really enjoy American history. And I've seen some people have that conversation where they're like, why would we were talking American history and someone went, how can I respect somebody that ever sold human beings? And they're like, well, you know, we're just talking like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of folks back in the day. It's like, this is a part of who they are. And so they look at this one aspect of them, or they look at the fact that like, you know, classical music. Dom and I have these conversations all the time where most classical concert halls, the reason they're failing is they just play Bach. No, they don't. They ignore Bach because they can't play Bach because he's too hard. They play Beethoven, Mozart, and Rachmaninoff. And like the joke is classical music is run by dead white people that haven't been around. And so we look at a bunch of stuff like that where I agree we need to integrate and we need to be more inclusive and do stuff like that. But I think some of the pushback of how we're going to do it is some folks think we're just all of a sudden going to like, we're going to wake up one day and all of a sudden we're going to be playing Jay-Z in the Carnegie Hall. And it's just going to be like no transition or something where it's like, I mean, hearing Jay-Z if a concert orchestra, I think it'd be pretty freaking cool.
No, that sounds lit.
Yeah. For the record, welcome to Conversations in Conservative America. I have a lot of folks around me that are like that. It's weird.
Like a lot of the people in my life, that's where they come from. So I'm very familiar with a lot of these thoughts. But like to what Dom was saying, it's like, well, what's the issue or what's the fear rather? And I just don't know how collectively and generally speaking, white people wouldn't naturally fear being on the receiving end of what ancestrally their people did to us. Like that's the natural fear. So when you talk about putting black people on level playing field, like that's what you're telling us. Like we're setting them up to come and get you. Like,
is that what that means?
In the mind, yeah. mostly subconsciously in a lot of them. But yeah, but it's like we've been saying this whole conversation. Okay, no. The somebody once gave me this metaphor. They were talking about like, okay, so we're all sitting down playing Monopoly, and we all start at the same time, and then two random people come in 4 hours later. They start off with the exact same amount of money and everything else that we got, but we have been playing for 4 hours. So
Oh, ain't
Atlanta,
no properties left.
you know what I mean? Like nothing left. Everywhere this person lands, they're now paying and they're just struggling to survive. But then we say, okay, we're gonna put you on level playing field. We just gave them a good chance at beating us. Whereas before, they were solidly underneath us. And it's like the same concept. You put us on level playing field, and it's like, whoa. And it's this mindset of like we're in competition with each other. Granted, a lot of society is in competition with each other, which I think causes a lot of problems. But to your other point, and I'm not quite sure where it all the way tied in, as far as like the Thomas Jefferson, George Washington thing goes, I'm not going to say where I land on this, but ultimately, it's very easy to look and say, "Oh, you used to own people. I don't respect you." Like, I mean, like I get that completely.
Yeah, for the record, I'm not saying
Yeah,
I'm not saying ignore those people. By the way, I just want to clarify. I'm
yeah.
not saying we should ignore the fact that they own people because that's jacked up and not good.
But see, and I
I
think that
yeah.
that's what, if I'm understanding what critical race theory is correctly, is what it'll do is teach, hey, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson did these great, cool, amazing things. But just because they did them doesn't make them like superheroes who never had any flaws. These are their shortcomings. These are their failures. Just specifically pertaining to race. You know, like,
Yeah.
okay, this is how black people are affected by what George Washington did. And it's like we're not saying he's a terrible person. It's just this is what he did.
So again, right, David, hate to put you under the bus like this,
Go for it.
but if all of a sudden on the camera, like somebody came around the corner, held in chains, and said, I finished cleaning the kitchen, master. What do you want next? And you cracked a whip and told them to go do something else. Whatever the color of that person's skin, I'd be like, yo, stop. Set that person free. Figure out how this whole situation happened, and let's try and prevent that from happening again. But if I didn't do that, and then just continued on with this call, and then someone else found out about that or read that in the history books, it'd be like, so what were you doing when you saw this dude in 2021 owning slaves? So like, yes, and it's interesting that, to think about that conversation, because one of the things that's happened since I started my PhD program was, Georgetown, where I went for my master's.
Big flex.
Stop. This wasn't discovered then, because I'd actually known this for a while, and some other people had known this too. It came to public consciousness that the way Georgetown made the money to buy the land and build the school was the Jesuits owned and sold slaves. And so they kind of had to come to reconcile with that. Like, how do we deal with the blood that we had to spill, the lives we had to destroy in order to create this institution? So then you have to stop and think. It's like, okay, but there are other institutions, right? Like, I'm now in Nashville at Vanderbilt, and to everybody's knowledge, no one has discovered the secret, text that demonstrates otherwise. Vanderbilt never owned slaves. It was never into that. They did have dealings with, various partners of the Confederacy, but they weren't involved in the slave trade directly. But you were a big, expensive, prestige-driven institution in the South. Like, you gonna tell me that doing all of that, you never brushed up, you never dealt with, you never benefited from slavery in one way, shape, or another? And I mean, we were talking about, I mentioned Marxism earlier, or, we talked about the sort of monopoly example. It seems to me that, like, monopoly is a bad model for how society should work, which kind of gets the critical race theory being anti-capitalist piece, I think, maybe distinct from Marxist. But with all that going on, at a certain point in time, guilt by association, the whole structure is problematic.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know? And
Yeah.
when it comes to capitalism, there are a number of books, and there's a guy who actually wrote a book on this. If it weren't for slavery, capitalism would never have gotten off the ground.
Yeah, because cheap labor, you can make money. You can
Well-
make so much money if you don't pay folks.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. If you want, it's interesting. You can like, although it's like, why don't we make the old wonders and marvels of the world? Why are there no like massive construction projects like there were back in the day? And simple answer is because you got to pay people, and then you got to pay people insurance, and then OSHA, and then all these other things. Like it's so like, you want to know why the Transcontinental Railroad got built so efficiently? Because either you built it or you died. Not either you built it or you went and started streaming video games on Twitch. You know, like if my job's jacked up, it's just like, all right, I'll go find another one. Where other times it's like, is this what you do? Like one of the things I'm hoping to get from some of this stuff is I really want to like. All right, I'll go Jesus-y. All right, so one of the big things that I really get struggle and frustrated with, like why some folks don't want to look at critical race theory, is at the core, every single religious person in the Christian faith believes in depravity of man. There is not one person that can honestly say we are good people in God's eyes because we have a speck of unholiness. So that means we're completely unholy. People are evil, people are gray. There is no way to that because I am not pure until I die and get to the other side. That being said, we look at the Bible, we look at people like David who got so horny, he killed a guy, impregnated her, and ticked off God so much that God killed that baby. Like, David should have been fighting, killing people, but David decided, no, I'm going to go walk around on a roof and stare at naked women in bathtubs and go look at stuff like that. I'm named after that guy. I have to own that fact that, like, that's in the Bible. Moses died and never got to the promised land because he directly ignored God. George Washington did a lot of great things, made a nation that, you know, we can do a lot of things in. There's a lot of great scientific advancements, a lot of positive has happened. A lot of evil has happened as well. And one of the things that I want talked about as a religious person is I want to know evil when I face it. I want to see it and I want to come to terms with it because, like, as much as some of the things we could say, it's like, oh yeah, the South was making so much money pre-1865, and if I look at through a very specific lens of like, oh, freeing the slaves made, and like the economy tanked in the 60s and 70s, it's like, yeah, because all of a sudden folks didn't have their free labor, and that's a lot of folks, and that once they lost slavery, they, you know, they could say they had good relations with their slaves, which is a whole Daughters of the Confederacy BS thing that got pushed in 1907, but there's a lot of stuff where it's like a lot of good people benefited from very evil things. Same as like I'm currently having this call on a MacBook Pro with my iPhone right here, while wearing pants probably made in Taiwan somewhere, for all I know, because we as Americans benefit from sex slaves and child labor all the time. But if we were to really have a conscious heart about it, we'd be naked all the time, you know, and like that's. Yeah, you know, are doing stuff. Yeah, and so like it's one of those. It's.
Yeah, I kind of want to check my tag. Like, does it say made in China?
And it's really complicated about stuff like that, about how we want to look at things. And to me, I want that gray taught. I want to understand that. Yeah, not only did Tulsa happen, but cocaine. The reason that's like been seen as like the more Black American drug is because the CIA put it in the streets to go fund folks. To go like fund projects. You know, we have the Tuskegee experiment when they put syphilis in groups of people and then didn't tell them they had it. They said, oh, it's a penicillin shot, and then they traced the syphilis. That happened. And then you have folks like Teddy Roosevelt, who was quoted saying that, which was the height of eugenics, which someone with Jewish blood in me, I freaking hate eugenics, because, you know, something called the Holocaust happened. But Teddy Roosevelt was a fan of eugenics, calling humans beings cattle, where, you know, some cattle you never leave out of the barn. And some cattle you have to put down because you want to see the good cattle survive. That happened. Something that I like that got taught in a classroom that I was in was the Cuban Civil War, the Spanish-American War. One of the lines that I watched a bunch of 7th graders stumble with was the fact that the way the Spanish-American War got marketed to America was we were giving Cuba its independence. Cubans are like people of color. And at that time there was a majority of them were black. So America just freed a nation of black folks while there was a bunch of Jim Crow laws being on there. So America had to really change its propaganda of how they advertised the Spanish American War to the American people and convincing folks to go fight for the Cubans. Because, we just said, hey, we gave Cubans independence. We just freed a nation of black folks. What do we do now? But, we're not going to give the ones here voting rights because we can't do that. That's an actual moral issue, and the seventh graders that got taught that literally stared at him and went, wait, what? And the teacher went, yeah. Try to make sense of that. And they, obviously they couldn't because they're seventh graders. They're trying to figure out which, like their pants goes in some days. But, that to me, that grave of especially American history, or just world history in general, is a lens I don't think we appreciate enough. That, yeah. And there's so many other examples I can give of that how that gray is just ignored, and just I don't know, maybe I just had the benefit of having the right teachers at the right time ask those questions, but I think that there is a desire that we want to get to know American history, and I just find it weird that some folks don't want to understand that, or they look at that bad stuff, they look at the fact that Abraham Lincoln wasn't only freed slaves as a political move, not because he was a great person. But then you say stuff like that, and because they put these people up on such high pedestals, it's really hard to bring them down because we forget, again, depravity of men. We are all broken people. So why am I going to put someone the godlike status and ignore the fact that they're a human being just like me? Because they ain't Jesus, so I ain't going to worship them. I don't know. That's just some of the things that I always get frustrated at. It's just I just want to talk about the fact that happened too. Celebrate the good, because World War II is awesome. I really like the battles. That's cool. It's awesome. My dad went to the Citadel, so I got a lot of Civil War history, and we used to live near Gettysburg, and Gettysburg is one of my favorite battles and stuff like that. But I also really enjoy Robert E. Lee as a general. The fact he fought for the Confederacy, I don't like, but there's a gray there that saying Robert E. Lee was one of the best American generals, and while the Union went from one drunkard to the other and just happened to find the right one to beat Lee in the end. That's a conversation but you get folks that want to bash Lee because he fought for the Confederacy, but you miss the fact that Grant was just as racist as Lee was, and it's this whole thing that we just want to have a good and bad, and we don't want to have gray.
So if I can just piggyback off that right now, and
yeah.
I apologize if this hits a nerve.
Go for it.
You do. One of the best rhetoricians in terms of public speaking, oration, and ability to sway a crowd, and actually not that bad at putting some logic puzzles together, Adolf Hitler.
Oh yeah.
And some critical race theorists have gone so far as to point out something interesting that happens in Mein Kampf, where he starts talking about, everyone's looking at me as though, this plan for the Holocaust is something absolutely terrible. But King Leopold, just a couple of decades ago, went to Africa and wiped out almost half of the Congo. What have we been doing for the past centuries in various different parts of the world? We thought all of that was just fine and dandy. But now that it's starting to hit close to home, people are getting a little upset. That's one of the arguments that he sort of makes out in Mein Kampf to sort of excuse what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And critical race theory is a useful tool for pointing out, hey, he wasn't right, he wasn't terrible, but he had a way to justify what he was doing and explaining what he was doing that managed to deceive massive amounts of people into getting on board with it. Not to mention the fact that anti-Semitism was widespread throughout all of Europe. How that
and America.
All of those people of Jewish descent throughout Europe all together in one particular place.
The beginning of birth control and eugenics in America was simply to get rid of disorders and diseases, as well as making sure there was only the perfect human. The concept of the perfect human was a massive conversation of the 20s in America. But you start talking eugenics, you start talking Margaret Sanger, and a lot of folks are oh, that didn't really happen here. Oh, it certainly did. Look at Woodrow Wilson on a Tuesday. That so happened here.
I mean, look, we got to stop, if we're talking about eugenics, talking past tense.
Yeah, it's here too.
Women in ICE detention centers were given hysterectomies.
So jacked up.
I don't understand how you have a conversation about that without connecting it to this
I-
long legacy.
And as someone with, even though I have a more, I guess, desirable learning disability of ADHD, the fact that like a lot of times eugenics, like some folks, like they find out they're going to have a child with Down syndrome, they'll support it right away.
Yeah.
Like, or the fact that like one of the major, I hope I don't hit a nerve with this, which I hope I don't start a conversation. A lot of the whole like anti-vax theme of just like, oh, don't get vaccinated, it'll cause autism. Which means you're so afraid of your child potentially getting autism that you're risk from getting measles and polio and stuff like that. And like it's so frustrating, you know, because like, yeah, and it's a lot like, and I guess we'll bring it back to critical race theory. It's like I want to make sure that like, because I think something I read in one of the videos is like making sure it's age appropriate. But like we could always start teaching that, yeah, America was this giant evil great big bad, but then like, but we still live here. And if you start teaching America is this great evil big bad all the time and nothing but that, then I'm not going to want to stay, or I'm going to want to like start doing some stuff. But I think it's just one of those, I think the goal that I've enjoyed from diving into some of the critical race theory, which seeing some stuff I've already done, is just that like there's some good, but you sure as hell better know the bad that happened too, because sometimes the good is just good and there was nothing that necessarily got there. But sometimes we stepped on some people to get there. The Trail of Tears should not just be a one-day taught in history class thing. Like, in the concept of, like, you know, moving the American Indian was just like, oh, that was just a thing, or stuff like that. Or the fact that, like, we get taught, we spent 2 weeks on the Boston Massacre. 2 weeks on the Boston Massacre. I spent studying John. I don't know how I got this lucky. I got a Princeton teacher, a Princeton grad school doctor that was my history teacher in high school, that we spent like a week studying John Locke's social contract, and the fact that like the government's job, they have a contract with the people to protect and take care of us. And I can easily apply that principle to Black Lives Matter. It was just like, oh yeah, it's this. That's like the Boston Tea Party. A bunch of folks got pissed off, caused $1 million of property damage. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And we praised the Boston Tea Party, but we backtalked the stuff that happened in Minnesota last year. It's like, so critical race theory to me is either we say there's some good in this, or we start teaching that there was some bad in that. But we don't want to start saying the founding fathers were a bunch of terrorists, because they were terrorists. But like, and so to me, it's, I don't know. I'm ranting. You all got me pissed off and stuff like that again.
Tell people the truth. Like, I think one of the biggest problems in America is, like, generally speaking, Americans don't like anybody saying anything that could even be perceived as anti-American or negative towards America. So, like, all things in life, as far as I understand, good and bad. And it's like just depending on the moment in time, the day, whatever, is going to determine what you're getting. So in reality, anybody who in 2021 or in any time throughout history can expect any person to be all good all the time is only deceiving themselves. Having laid that foundation, I don't see why we wouldn't move forward teaching this is who George Washington was. Good, bad, indifferent. You decide how you feel about this person on a personal, individual level. But as a contributing member to American history, this is who he was, this is what he did. And I think if people get upset with America and leave America, like, isn't that what America is? People who didn't like where they were and came here, you know, it would be nothing more American than to leave America.
Nothing more American than going to Canada.
So, you know, it's interesting, because this conversation has more or less veered into, I think, the kind of reason why this is a controversy.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
We're not really talking about critical race theory. We're talking about educating through history, specifically, with a critical race lens. And that is where people start to get upset. But critical race theory is the sort of banner that they're using to attack it. And they want it out of schools. Because here's the thing, you know, no one's teaching Kimberly Crenshaw in K through 12. No one's talking about Derek Bell Richard Delgado, Joan Stefansek, none of them. Cheryl Harris, nobody is bringing those into any conversation. Maybe
they mentioned W.D. Bois once, and then they move on.
Maybe once. I just learned about those other people today. So,
W.E.B. Du Bois was writing in the early 1900s, but before that, critical race theory didn't exist then. So how can he be critical race theory?
Oh, I read something that he was a part of it, like a couple articles.
He wrote articles that were very influential. I mean,
okay.
The idea of double consciousness, of the veil, his whole book, Souls of Black Folks, is very much an influential text within much of African American studies, African American literature, and Black studies. And of course, like, you know, the people who are crits were reading that, but you can't really call him a critical race theorist. I mean, if anything, he was a sociologist. He kind of invented sociology in many ways.
Okay, fair. I'm wrong on that. Thanks for calling me on that. No, you're good.
It gets back to the fact that, you know, there's the definition I gave you at the very beginning, and then there's all this other stuff that I guess we can include in it or not include in it, and depending on whatever it is that we want to do. But I guess the thing that I really want to put on the table is what people are upset about is that this is a way of telling a story about the United States. This is a way of talking about United States as though race matters, as though race has an impact on the country in a variety of different ways. And people don't want that story to exist, because if you have that story, then you can look at something like, you know, the fact that women who were held in ICE detention centers are getting hysterectomies and begin to think, well, when has that happened before and why? Or think about, wait, detention centers? So like Japanese internment, but all over again? And start asking, well, what's going on here? And once you start putting those things together, it begins to paint certain parties, certain ideas in a bad light.
And it's also annoying because, so one of the things I wanted, I was talking to Dom about, like, and how you're mentioning, like, it's how all this stuff is being portrayed, and there's a massive issue which some congressmen are finally doing something about, and it's the issue of how information about certain things is being there. I am now aware, because I watched 2 PragerU videos, I'm about to get more suggested in my YouTube recommendations. And so that's like, if you it's how the algorithm works. And it's funny that, like, we're getting more and more extremist on both sides these days, because, like, if I start looking in the critical race theory and all I read are articles that are critical of it, my metadata gets sold, and then I get pushed more information about it. Now, if I start looking at some of the offers that you were sharing, I'm going to start getting more metadata sold and information tell me why it's correct. And so the frustrating part is, it's like we aren't actually having a conversation about critical race theory in time. I think there is a social media factor about it, simply because, like, I was telling an example with Dom. I don't like Donald Trump. I haven't liked him since he walked down the escalator. So I was a never Trumper. I was registered Republican back in 2016, and I went independent the next year because I'm like, this isn't the party I've been supporting the past 10 years of my life. Because I used to work the polls with my dad. I've been voting since I'm 18. I was super into it. Like, I was like, I'm out of this. Because I don't like Donald Trump, you could put anything into his mouth that's remotely racist, and I go, that sounds about right. And then I could stop there, and now I think Donald Trump said that. And then you start putting Facebook memes towards me, and then you start putting YouTube videos about him saying things that I disagree, like I think he said. And then it's like, wait a second, did he actually say that? And like down the line, it's kind of why you get some folks like that. They're saying like, and then you got the reverse side of people were saying Joe Biden is one of the progressively liberal Democrat presidents we've ever had in our entire American history. And I'm like, whoa, you aren't hearing Kamala Harris saying we need to stop caravans coming to the border. You're a lot of friends of mine on Facebook.
People think that. People do not think that he is a moderate.
I told someone at the Democratic Party hasn't gone more liberal since Bill Clinton, and they said I'm crazy. They said Obama was the most liberal president we've ever had, and I'm like, Obama was just as liberal as FDR, almost to a T. And so it's like we see stuff like that. But if you believe that thing, the internet's going to give that to you. If you think critical race theory is going to make like kind of flop the way American system works, and you think American critical race theory is going to put down white folks to pick up black folks, and you Google that, you're going to get more searches for that. And so it's super hard. That, like, today's was really hard for me to find stuff because, one, maybe YouTube's just listening to conversation I'm having and giving me more stuff like that. But it was really hard for me, one, to find a couple articles that were critical of it, that were actually critical, weren't just news articles, because my stuff is more designed for things that are going to be pro-critical race theory. So to actually find something that was anti-critical race theory took me about 15 minutes. And then once that 15 minutes kicked in, my algorithm kicked in and I started getting more stuff that way as well, you know? And so it was actually a challenge for me to go out and do that, where I can't just search bad critical race theory bad, because it will still give me some good. And it's really annoying because that's how that works. And then Facebook stuff is so much worse. We can't tell what article's real and what's not. So we hear people saying like, oh, they're not euthanizing, they're giving hysterectomies to people in ICE detention centers. Oh, that news source is just anti-Trump. Oh, did you hear Joe Biden's going to raise taxes to all the folks to this? Oh, that news source is just anti-liberal. Blah, blah, blah. So we get this thing where we only want stuff that agrees with us. And then we hold on to that. And then when we see the other side, we're only seeing like a slightly other side or a very negative side around. It's really frustrating because like some of the conversations I had with folks about critical race theory were bringing up points that I'm like, I know for a fact this isn't there. Like I had someone legitimately show me something with this about like critical race theory and like Black Lives Matter, where it's like, Black America wants to have a white person tax. And I had 3 people show me the exact same image. And I'm like, hang on a second. I have not heard that once. And I've been marching for about 2 months now. Where do you hear that from? And they're like, oh, I saw this thing and I read this article. I'm like, that's not true. And they're like, well, you say it's not true. I'm like, I can guarantee if they tax me for being white, I'm going to protest with you because that's just jacked up. But like, there's folks out there that are getting information that says that. And that, I think that if we don't talk about that part of critical race theory, we're missing why there's such a disconnect, why there's such passion for it against it. And I don't think it's just because we're seeing like, oh, it's all the racists from the 60s that don't like it now. No, it's all the people that are moderately conservative, that are probably conservative economically and a lot of other things, that because they're conservatively economic, they're just getting more articles saying it's anti this because they're also just anti-Marxist, which I don't think they have a problem with people that are being anti-Marxist. Same thing as I'm being anti-capitalist. Like, you know, I'm kind of anti both, but it's such a wild time we live in right now because we can't find what something actually is. Like Terrell, your definition of it was the first time I heard it spelled out that way, from like even hearing that it was a legal definition. And I've been trying to find stuff about it for the past like few weeks, and nothing about legal, like the whole law side of it, showed up once. That to me is wild and so messed up that we're trying to people who want to put this in schools, and I as a teacher can't even find stuff and like find information.
Time out. That's what I'm saying. Like, this conversation, and by this conversation, I mean the conversation that the nation is having, is not about critical race theory.
Yeah, and that's my point. Yeah, it's wild.
It's about the use of a critical race lens and the variety of things that we've talked about. You know, talking about Abraham Lincoln doing it as a political move as opposed to because he was a good guy. You know, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson owning slaves, so on and so forth. Bringing up facts about that isn't really critical race theory. It's just attention to the way that race has always been a part of American life, and especially those in power in America. Now, one thing I just want to make sure I add before, you know, just so everybody who's watching this can get it if they want it. If you Google critical race theory introduction PDF.
Doing it now.
You know, I've done it now, and the first hit that I have is uniteyouthdublin.files.wordpress.com. That link, if you click it, opens up a PDF in full of Critical Race Theory, the introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefansek. And it is basically them in the 90s breaking down what people have sort of said using critical race theory in law reviews, and basically the tools and the ways in which people understand race. Now, if you've been thinking about race and have been about conversations with Black Lives Matter, you'll read a lot of it and be like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. That's how that operates. And oh, so that's a word for that. Cool, right? A lot of it just seems very basic and is sort of in the groundwater. Some of this stuff gets disseminated through memes and just through pop culture. But this is someone in the 90s sort of just kind of giving a kind of, this is what this is. But nobody who's talking about banning it or implementing it in schools is talking about this. So.
And I think that goes. I mean, I messaged you, Keller, earlier, and I said that it's wild how the more information that technology allows us to have, the more we seem to shy away from it. And I think that is a big part of it. Algorithms, metadata, things like that they now have us arguing about something that's not even what we think we're arguing about. And I think a big fix of it is a lot of conversations like these. I mean, like you said, you hadn't heard it spelled out until Terrell said that. That comes from conversing with other people, with not staying in your own bubble and actually getting out and talking. Because I mean, you're right. It is hard to find stuff on the internet. I mean, it's you have to actually try to find things. You can't just do a quick Google search like you think you can and find something. You actually have to dig, and instant gratification society, that's not really a thing for us. So I think that conversations are a big part of, hey, let's actually get on the same page and understand what people are actually trying to do rather than what this hot topic word has been. Um, but we've gone on for a little bit over, so I do want to go ahead and kind of close things out, start wind down a little bit. I want to go into our final thoughts for all of our viewers who haven't seen us before. Final thoughts is where we each take 60 seconds, just 1 minute, to give the viewers one thing that we want you to take away from this conversation if you don't take anything else away from it. So we're going to go into that now. David, do you want to go first?
Sure. Um, I've been on the podcast a couple times, and one of the things I said my first one, which again, these two guys and Courtney Patterson have really inspired me to realize that, like, if I want change to happen, I need to be open to a lot of really wild out there things. And even though sometimes where it's difficult, being from the background I've had to unlearn a lot of stuff. I don't think that's bad. I think one of the things that I really enjoy about being a Christian is how mysterious God is, how God can move in one way at this part of my life and another way in the other. That's almost the antithesis. And if I don't make learning a process, then it won't be a process. And that being said, those that want to implement critical race theory, which we've mentioned how much they can hijack stuff, that are white and are looking to do the right thing, don't whiplash yourself so much to the point that you start stereotyping, which can happen, which I myself will have to admit in doing this new approach have caught myself doing a couple times, where I want to be so open-minded, I ended up like putting thoughts on people. It sucks. I hate to admit it, but we're gonna, as I can say as a teacher, learning's a process. We're gonna make mistakes, and then if you make that mistake, don't stop. Keep trying. Keep talking to people. Keep asking folks, but don't just assume everyone's going through something. If you truly believe certain groups of people aren't a monolith, then actually act that out in stuff like that. So let's just not shove it down the throat. And lastly, I'll keep it quickly. Don't just label every single person that's anti-critical race theory or conservative racist, because then you're doing the exact same thing as they are. And you're stopping them from learning because you're calling them a jackass. And when you call someone a jackass, they're not going to listen to you. They're going to come back fighting. So love folks, and be as open-minded to them as you want them to be to you.
Yeah, that. Terrell?
Coming off of this one, I tried my best to kind of, because honestly, it's one of those things where it's like, I've spent so much time investing and studying this and kind of, really thinking about it and trying to engage it. Even some of the disagreements that critics have amongst themselves, where I'm just sort of like, as an enterprise, I think this is much more complicated than anybody's sort of engaging with it. And it's also just sort of a thing, it's a label for something else that we're trying to sort of hash out here. I think it really comes back to a culture war thing that we were sort of talking about in another episode. But if I had to tell folks to do one thing, it's read. Google Critical Race Theory Introduction, PDF, like I said, read that, read other books, read other people when they're talking, read both in the literal and vernacular sense of the word.
All right, look at him.
All right.
He's filling us up with that timer.
It'll be quick. Keller said he had to unlearn some things, and I like that. So my final thoughts would be, let's unlearn some things. You know, sometimes that is what it takes, and like he said, it doesn't have to be bad. So whatever you need to unlearn, unlearn it.
All right. For me, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I really gathered from this is that right now American society is arguing about, they're not arguing about what they think they're arguing about. We had this conversation titled Critical Race Theory, and we ended up spending very, very little time talking about critical race theory and so much more time talking about education and just talking about history as it actually took place. Yet, critical race theory is this huge boogeyman in America, and it's split everyone up, and we don't know what to do with it. We don't even know exactly what it is. We don't know what we're talking about when we're arguing with people, and we're getting nowhere. So, my final thoughts would be to listen, to have conversations and to listen. Like we had a conversation tonight. We discovered that we're not talking about critical race theory. Like we heard a definition of critical race theory, and then for the next hour we talked nothing about that definition and talked about something completely different, which is good. It's what we needed to talk about. It's what we're actually talking about as a country. But my point is, if we were to actually have real conversation with one another and listen for the sake of understanding and learning, we would probably agree on a lot more than we think we do. We may not have these fears of POC are going to take over the country and we're going to be on the bottom. If we listened and understood, okay, no, we just want to learn what actually happened, how that's affecting us now, and what we can do to change it so that we can, all be on a level playing field. And then, of course, obviously, there's fears of what a level playing field can do. But my gist is, let's listen, let's understand, and then that way we can actually make some positive headway. Yeah, and that's that.
That's all I got.
All you got.
Some prisoner.
Yeah, I'm gonna close out on some prayer real quick, and yeah, we can go from there. Uh, Thank you guys for this conversation. Thank you for the fact that we were able to really, really learn something that so many people think that they know, but we don't actually know. Hopefully, that this conversation goes forward. It can get into the right ears where other people can learn and grow from it. And I ask that we can see some change and some positive headway come from it. In your name, we pray. Amen. All right, all right. Guests, Terrell Keller, thank you so much for being willing to join us and have this conversation to kind of hash this thing out. For everyone that's been viewing and sticking around, thank you guys so much. Thank you for engaging. We had 100 comments on Restream tonight. That's what's up. So thank you guys so much for engaging and having conversation about this. This is what we want. This is what we feel like we need. Yeah, we'll be back at you again next Tuesday. We'll also be here Friday with World in the Meantime. So are we going to be here Friday?
Anniversary?
It is, but I don't know if we're doing anything that night. We'll get back to you on the World in the Meantime.
You better say that.
I ain't even mean. Anyways, so yeah, make sure you're following, liking,
All the things.
all the things, sharing. Yeah, and let's get this conversation into as many ears as we possibly can. And with that, I'm gonna let you guys go, and you guys enjoy your night.